Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. I'm William Kennedy, the State Social Work Director here with the Department of Public Health. Thank you for joining us today for our program, Suicide, Prevention, Intervention, and Postvention. If you have questions about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email are on our screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts and evaluations are available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access those materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses and social workers for this program. In order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and the evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, CE credit will only be awarded for 2 years for nurses and social workers expiring on July 1, 2023. If you're watching this program on demand and want to receive a social work CE certificate, you will need to complete the social work test and send it in, along with your sign-in sheet and evaluation. If you're watching this program live, there is no social work test required. For social workers, if you're watching this program live, it qualifies for classroom hours. If you're watching on demand, it is considered non-classroom hours. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. Renee Carpenter is the Social Work Clinical Coordinator of the Alabama Tom Bigby Regional Commission. Also, Renee is well known to us. She used to be our State Social Work Director, as a friend here at the department, and actually worked for the department for well over 28 years. So anyway, thank you, Renee. We've had a lot of interest in this program. Unfortunately, over the last several months, we've had a lot of contacts, people coming into our clinics or people that have contact with the health department that have had threats of suicide. Certainly, we've seen in our communities an uptick in suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, as well as those that have been successful with their suicides. It seems like in the news every week there's somebody that we know that may be famous, or somebody that's in the public that has committed suicide as well. And so a lot going on, a lot of questions, a lot of things going on. So with that said, I kind of turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, and it's good to be back. This is a hot topic, unfortunately, and before we get started, I want to make sure that because we are seeing an uptick, if this has impacted you recently, if this is something that may be an emotional trigger for you, you may not need to watch it live. It may be best to wait and watch it later on demand. If you start feeling anxious while we're presenting, then please just turn it off and go take care of yourself. That's much more important. But our objectives today is that by the end of the program that you will be able to list 3 signs of suicidal ideation, that you will know best practice interventions if you suspect that a person is considering suicide, and also that you'll have an increased level of confidence when working with individuals and families that are impacted by suicide. So to start, let's talk about the definitions. Suicide is an intentional act of self-harm that results in death. An attempt is when a person harms themselves with the intention of dying, but that action does not result in death. And then suicidal ideation, which is what we see the most of, is thoughts of suicide that could be anything from just a fleeting thought to actually creating a plan for how to take their own life. So in order to understand sort of how we got where we are today, we need to look at suicide throughout history. So this will be a brief run through history related to suicide. Back in antiquity, during Greek and Roman times, there was sort of a relaxed attitude about suicide. It wasn't something that was shameful or hidden the way that it often is today. There were 2 Greek philosophers that were publicly opposed to suicide, and those were Aristotle and Pythagoras. Now, Aristotle was opposed to it because he viewed it as suicide was robbing society of the services of the individual who took his own life. Pythagoras had a little bit of a different view on that. He viewed suicide as wrong because in his mind there was a finite number of souls in the world at any given time. When one was born, someone else died. And if a person died early, if they took their own life, then that sort of offset the balance. And so that was why he was opposed to it. When we look at Roman times, it was actually forbidden in 3 situations. And that is with soldiers, it was viewed as desertion, which was shameful. And then for slaves, it was viewed as wrong because, or it was forbidden for slaves because they were property, and that was robbing the slave owner of revenue or of wealth. And then it was also wrong or forbidden for those who were accused of capital crimes, because if a person was executed, then the government actually confiscated their wealth, and so it was a revenue loss for the government. Now, as we move to the Middle Ages, we see that it was heavily influenced by religion, and I looked at the 3 major religions, which are the 3 Abrahamic religions, and all of them are opposed to suicide. In Islam, it is strictly forbidden, and it's actually written out. It's part of the law. So it's very difficult to find even any statistics that are related to Muslims who commit suicide. In Judeo-Christian circles, it's not specifically spelled out, but it is viewed as murder turned 180 degrees. So it's self-murder, and therefore it's considered wrong. Now, in the early Christian church, those who attempted suicide were actually excommunicated until they repented of that sin, and then they were allowed to come back into the fold. Both Jews and Christians who died by suicide, typically they would be buried outside of the consecrated graveyard or in a separate section. So they were actually punished for eternity, which is just, it's horrible for the families back then. Also in Christianity, because Christians do bury their dead facing east, where the feet face east and the head faces west, a lot of times they would actually be buried backwards, or they would be buried face down and in a north-south orientation rather than east-west, so that anybody who came through that cemetery, even hundreds of years later, would know that this person either committed murder or they committed suicide. Now, superstition was also big back in these days, and that heavily influenced how suicides were treated. Executions, those who committed murder and were executed, they were often buried at a crossroads. Suicides were treated in the same way, so I cannot imagine the horror of losing a family member to suicide and then having their burial be what's known as a profane burial, which is where the body is desecrated. It may be dragged through the streets, face down, and then thrown on the trash heap outside of town, or buried at a crossroads. And it was believed that those who killed themselves and those who committed murder were also very susceptible to demonic control. So they were buried at a crossroads to confuse their ghost. So the ghost would not know where to go, which direction to take. Also, bodies may have been staked, which is where a wooden stake is driven through the heart. And again, that was to prevent their ghost from wandering around, as it was believed that they would not go to a positive place, whatever their religion referred to that as, in the afterlife. Now, in modernity, as we approach the 1600s, it became widely viewed as a criminal act. And the reason that that happened is because there were some folks who found a loophole with the church, the early church. They realized that if they killed themselves, they couldn't ask for forgiveness, so they would possibly spend eternity in hell, it would be their belief. So they decided they would commit murder, then repent of the murder so they could get back into the good graces of the church, and then the government would kill them. awful as that sounds, that's what was happening. And so they turned, the government decided to make it a criminal act and subject them to criminal penalties so that if they committed suicide, their wealth, just like back in antiquity, their wealth would be confiscated by the state or by the government. Now, by the 19th century, we started learning more and more about mental illness. And by the middle of the 20th century, it was no longer considered a criminal act. It was considered a mental illness. So let's look at some statistics. Now, the most recent statistics I could find were for 2019, and this is for the United States. According to the CDC, suicide was the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. That's all races, ages, gender, whatever. It was the 10th leading cause.
And actually, you know, this month is Men's Health Month, and it's actually the 8th leading cause of death for men here in Alabama. And so,
Wow.
you know, as we focus on men's health this month, that's one of the topics that we've kind of looked at is suicide in men. So
Men tend to use more lethal means,
Yep.
so they tend to be more successful. Suicide in 2019, it was the second leading cause of death for young people, and that's ages 10 to 34. It's second only to accidents. Now, let me say right here that while the CDC only looked at ages from 10 to 34, that's not to say that children younger than 10 don't attempt and complete suicide, because we have been seeing that. And here's one of the shocking statistics to me, and that's that there's nearly 2.5 times as many suicides as homicides. We hear about the homicides, we hear about the suicides of famous people, but we don't tend to hear as much about suicides, and yet there were 2.5 times as many suicides as homicides. Nearly half of all suicide deaths, or not nearly, but actually slightly over half, of the deaths were by firearms. Now, you mentioned that it's the 8th leading cause of death for men. Men tend to use firearms. It's a much more lethal way to kill yourself, much more successful, if you want to call that a success. But 80 to 90% of the people who use a firearm to attempt suicide will be successful. The other types of suicides, there's opportunity to intervene, not so much with a gun. Now, if we look at the suicide rates from 1999 to 2018, just about 20 years, it increased by 35.2% across the nation. Alabama is right in there in the middle of that. I don't remember specifically the statistic, but it's still around 30% increase. So that's huge. And in 2019, someone died by suicide every 11 minutes. This program will last about an hour. You do the math. That's a horrible statistic. I want you to remember these numbers. 47,511 suicides in the United States during 2019, 804 in Alabama. I can guarantee you that we're going to see a much higher number once we get the 2020 stats come out.
And Renee, I've got some information I'm going to share in a few minutes, but
Okay.
My numbers are from 2018, and they're almost identical. So it's not something that, you know, that was an source year. 2019 was 2018. There were exactly every 11 minutes. 48,000 Americans in 2018 that committed suicide.
So it's been pretty steady.
Yeah, very steady.
Okay. So what causes a person to want to take their own life? And it's when a crisis or crises, a stack of crises, overwhelm their ability to cope. And I think that's one of the reasons we see such a high rate among younger people is they haven't had the years of learning how to cope with stresses like some older people have. But when a crisis or crises overwhelm their ability to cope, oftentimes suicide is the result. So what are the risk factors? Well, a previous suicide attempt. If a person has attempted in the past, there is a greater likelihood that they will also attempt again. Now, 90% of the people who attempt and their attempt is interrupted and they survive, 90% of them report being grateful that they were not successful. So we do know that those feelings are temporary, but those 10% are probably the ones that will attempt again. Having feelings of helplessness or hopelessness, experiencing a stressful life event such as the loss of a loved one, particularly if that loved one died by suicide. We see a much higher increase in the deaths of other family members when a loved one died of suicide. Substance abuse, of course, having a foggy mind will also make a big difference, not being able to think clearly or carry out a good plan for how to cope with a crisis. Having suicidal thoughts and a firearm in the home. Again, firearms are the most lethal form of or method used for suicide. It tends to be an impulsive reaction to a crisis. So being suicidal and having a firearm in the home is truly a deadly combination. Now, also having a history of psychiatric disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, bipolar disorder, these do increase the risk. A history of victimization such as physical violence, intimate partner violence in particular, but also being the victim of a sexual abuse or sexual assault raises the risk. A physical condition that causes depression, like a chronic or a terminal illness, may lead to suicide or suicidal thoughts. Being a member of the LGBTQ community with an unsupportive family is a high risk factor. And we do see a huge increase in the risk of suicide among young people who are just coming out as LGBTQ. There also seems to be a genetic link, so having a relative who had suicidal thoughts or who completed suicide also makes a person at a slightly higher risk. And loneliness and social isolation. And that's why we're thinking we're going to see a huge increase during 2020 because of the pandemic. So how do we prevent somebody from taking their own life? Well, first you've got to know what to look for. Talking about wanting to die, if they're experiencing tremendous guilt or shame, if they talk about being a burden to others, maybe they're thinking about taking their own life. Feeling empty, hopeless, extreme emotional or physical pain. Again, we'll go back to the terminal illness. Being overly anxious, sad, agitated, or filled with rage. And a lot of people don't consider being filled with rage as someone who may be suicidal, but it goes back to being impulsive. And an impulsive person may deliberately wreck their vehicle. Or they may, if they have access to a weapon, they may shoot themselves just in a moment of rage. If they have been researching ways to die, or if they've made a plan, if they're trying to obtain a weapon, or if they're writing out a will, any of those would be a sign. And also saying goodbye or giving away possessions. We hear a lot about giving away possessions, and of course not everyone does, and not everyone who is given away a possession is suicidal, but that is something to be aware of. Eating and sleeping more or eating or sleeping less than usual. That's a depression sign, but it's also one that a person is not just a little blue, but they're severely depressed. Extreme mood swings. High one minute, low the next. Withdrawing from friends or activities. This is one of those warning signs that was easily masked during the pandemic because we couldn't be around our friends and we couldn't participate in activities that we were normally a part of. And so how would we know if someone withdrew or was having the feeling or wanting to withdraw? Taking extreme risks. One example of this would be we know that law enforcement officers are at greater risk for suicide. Maybe they start going to work and they're not wearing their bulletproof vest anymore. Driving under the influence would be another one. Driving at extreme speeds, not wearing a seatbelt. Those are examples of taking extreme risk. And also abusing drugs or alcohol. How to prevent this? One thing we have to remember is that suicidal feelings are temporary. If you're my age or older, then you may remember Phil Donahue. He was probably the first or one of the first talk show hosts. Not Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil McGraw is a different person. But Phil Donahue is actually quoted as having said that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And I always think about that when I think about suicidal ideation. It's important to let other people know how you're feeling and ask for help. There are hotlines you can call. You can contact religious leaders, therapists, doctors, but ask for help. Let your doctor know that you're feeling suicidal. Take your prescriptions as directed. And of course, remove all means of self-harm. If you know that a person is feeling suicidal and they've told you that they're feeling suicidal, then make sure to remove particularly guns and ammunition, or at least remove one or the other. Ammunition is no good without the gun is no good without the ammunition. But make sure that if you are removing the ammunition, make sure to check the chamber and make sure that they have not already put one in the chamber. Remove knives, medications, and a lot of people don't want to take away a person's medication, but you can dispense it to them in the daily dose. But remove whatever means of self-harm they may be looking at. It may even come down to the point of removing the glass out of picture frames, because that can be broken and used to cut themselves. Of course, razors and knives, letter openers, anything that's sharp like that may need to be removed. And if the risk is imminent, call 911 or take the person to an emergency department. But here's a very important point, is never, ever promise to keep suicidal thoughts a secret. HIPAA is not an issue when it comes to suicide. If a person is saying that they are a threat to themselves, then make sure that you get them help. You do not have to keep that a secret. This is the Suicide Prevention Hotline. It is 1-800-273-TALK, which if you spell that, if the numbers would be 8255, but it spells out the word TALK, so that makes it easier to remember. Now, veterans are at a huge increased risk for suicidal ideation, and the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or Hotline has option 1 is specifically for veterans. You can also text if you would rather text with somebody rather than talking to a person. Text the word CONNECT to 741-741. There's also a chat option, which may be of interest to younger people, and that would be at the suicidepreventionlifeline.org. They do have a chat feature.
And so, Renee, I got a couple of things I'd like to talk about.
Okay.
There's a lot of new stuff going on, not only in the United States, but here in Alabama as well. And so back in 2019, in August of 2019, the FCC, along with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and the North American Numbering Council have actually working on a new number, 988 instead of 911, okay. 988, and this is suicide prevention number that can be used. I actually checked it right before we came on here, and it is already working. There is, like you said, an option for veterans.
And again, that is a huge issue. Even here in Alabama, we're seeing a lot of our veterans that are committing suicide or attempting suicide. And so in July of 2020, the FCC adopted the rules for this new phone number, 988. So for Americans that are in a crisis, they can call this number. Under the new rules, the 988 will be directed to a 1-800-273-TALK with the remain operational during this transition. And so next year, July 16th of 2022, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline will be up and going. Through the Alabama Department, through our legislature this year, they've passed a bill that is going to create a task force here in Alabama. Mental health, public health, and other groups will be a part of that task group to set up our system here in Alabama. And so we're excited about that and excited that this information and this project is going to be going on here in Alabama to help with prevention. Suicide prevention. In addition, you talked about our veterans there, and so also during the legislative session, there's a task force for veteran suicide task force, and that's actually been extended until the end of the legislative session for 2022. So that group is still meeting and still working on resources and things to help our veterans that find themselves in a crisis. And so we're excited about that and excited about prevention opportunities here in Alabama. Obviously, the need is great, and so a lot of resources and time is going to be put into this in the next year. So, anyway.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so intervention. What do we do when we think someone is imminently suicidal? The first thing is to take every threat seriously. Now, we all know that there are those who truly are attention-seeking. The problem is we don't know which ones may succeed with suicide and which ones are attention-seeking. So we don't need to take any threat lightly. And number two there is don't be afraid to ask the person if they are thinking about suicide. Now, when you look at historically how we've treated suicide victims, it's horrible, and it was considered something very shameful for many, many years, or centuries. And I think that's part of the reason why so many of us are afraid to say the word or ask the question. We truly don't want to know the answer. We're afraid the answer is yes, and then we don't know what to do about it. But don't tiptoe around the subject. Just straight out ask the question. Are you thinking of hurting yourself? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? Don't come at it with, oh, you're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? Or, oh, please tell me you are not going to hurt yourself. That doesn't give that person the opportunity to actually say, yes, I am. So be sure to address it directly. Are you thinking about suicide?
You know, in our health departments, we've seen, like I said, an uptick in this, and we've had several calls here to the central office asking, for assistance. And so, if you find yourself and you're interviewing or you're seeing a patient in one of the rooms there in your local health department, what are some things that you would do to try to get a little more information? What are some ways to try to pull that out?
You'd be surprised. They will really have a tendency to tell you what they're thinking. Ask them, have they made a plan? What is that plan? When do they plan to carry it out? Find out as much as you can about that plan and where they have their weapon of choice, so to speak. And if you look on down the line there, employ the assistance of others. If you're on the phone with someone, if you have to throw pencils into the hallway, do whatever you have to do to get someone's attention so that they can come in and assist you.
Right.
If there's someone that has more education, more knowledge, more experience dealing with suicidal people, bring them in and ask them to take the call. or you talk to the person together, the two of you. Also, if you do believe that threat is imminent, if they are telling you they're going to do it, try to find out where they are. Find their location and have you stay on the phone with them and have someone else call 911 to try to get assistance to them.
And we've actually had that happen.
We've had it happen
several times. And so what we, like you said, throw a pencil, get help, keep them on the line as we were talking, and so find out where they're located, and then that person can call law enforcement in that community and try to get somebody over there to do a well check on them. And we've had that happen, like I said, a few times. And it's great that you've got two people, so you've got somebody that can continue to talk to the patient, find out what's going on. Do they really have a means and a plan? And we're able to communicate that to that local law enforcement. And of course, trying to figure out who is that local law enforcement can be a challenge sometimes because, is it a county? Is it a city? What county? Is that town on the line? So is it, is it in this county or that county? Usually the local law enforcement can help you with that, though, because they can tell you who the 911, what the location is. And so we've had to work through that many a times.
Don't get frustrated if they transfer you to another unit,
right,
because that may happen too, but keep going with it. Don't let up. If the person has the plan and the means, particularly if they have a gun, that information needs to be passed on to 911. Those officers need to know that they may be walking into a dangerous situation. One thing, if the threat is not imminent, if they're not holding a weapon in their hand, then you can encourage them to get exercise, try to get out in the sunshine. We know that sunlight improves mood, exercise improves mood, so that will help. Try to give them a task to complete. It could be calling a religious leader, calling a friend. It could be as simple as washing their dishes, something to help them feel like they have accomplished something for the day. And then follow up with them. Say, walk 3 times around your house, and then I'm going to call you back in an hour. And do call them back. Do follow up with them. Remove the means of self-harm. We talked about that before. And do not leave the person alone if at all possible. Sometimes there is no option. They don't have anybody else to call to come in and sit with them. But if possible, just have someone in the room with them as long as it takes. Help them make an appointment to speak with someone, whether it's mental health or their doctor, someone who can help them with their feelings of depression and their suicidal thoughts. Now, if they have already inflicted harm, things change, and they change very quickly. The first thing you've got to do is call 911 or have someone call 911 while you stay on the phone with them. Find out what they've done and when they did it. So have they, are they sitting in a car in a closed up garage? How long have they been in there? Are they trying to die by carbon monoxide poisoning? Where is the garage? What's the location? Find out as much as you can. If they've cut themselves, where, how many times, how deep is it, what did you use? Any information that you can obtain that you can provide to law enforcement or to EMS would be a huge help. It's truly life-saving because they don't have to try to figure all of that out.
Overdose. I've seen a lot of overdose in my career, and it depends on what they took.
It does.
As to how you treat that. Do you want to try to bring it back up? Throw it back up. Also, Tylenol is an extremely dangerous medication when taken not as prescribed or as directed. So, unfortunately, I've seen some individuals who overdosed on Tylenol, and it takes 2 or 3 days for it to happen, but it really can. And so time is on their side if they can get help quickly.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's not on their side if it's been several hours or even a day, because now the damage has already been done.
The damage to the liver in particular.
Yeah.
Also, have they mixed it with alcohol?
Right.
Because that will change everything. Or if they've mixed multiple medications, how those interact with each other has a huge impact. So gather as much information as you can. Now, I think all of us are terrified. I know I am, and I've been doing this over 30 years, terrified of being alone and finding someone who has overdosed. What do you do? Do you call 911 and then try to do something, or do you intervene before you call 911? You start questioning, what do I do? It's very, very important, and I cannot stress this enough. If that person has overdosed on something, you need to find out how much they've taken, what they've taken, how long ago did they take it, where is the bottle located? If it was a pill bottle, where in the house is that pill bottle? If it was some type of poison, where is the container? Because all of these things will save a lot of time for emergency personnel who have shown up to try to rescue that person. Chances are, if you hang up with them in order to call 911, when you try to call them back, they're not going to answer. Either they're unconscious and they can't answer, or they don't want to answer. Or maybe they can't make their hand work well enough to answer the phone, depending on what they took. Try to get as much information from them as you can before you call 911. And that seems counterintuitive, but by the time EMS can get there, chances are the medication or the poison has already taken effect, and EMS will not know what they're dealing with. They need to know what they're dealing with. That will save a lot of time. So again, try to find out how much they've taken, what it is, where the containers are located, how much time has passed, and try to keep them talking. Try to keep them on the phone if you can. If you can put them on hold, call 911 and then get back on the phone with them, whatever you can do. But the main thing is to make sure that EMS knows what they're going to find when they get there and how to assess the situation very quickly.
And certainly if there's somebody that you can help you, they can maybe call through their cell phone or their phone while you continue to talk to them. And so, in our policy, we talk about don't leave them alone, whether that's on the phone, whether that's in the clinic, whether you're doing a home visit, however it is that you might come about that. So, but if you're alone, you got to do what you got to do first.
Right. Gather the information first and then call 911.
Do that as a quick assessment,
Right.
of what's going on. And so that you can help others, help them down the line.
Exactly, and that speeds up the process once emergency help has arrived. There are several do nots. One is do not use what I'm calling reverse psychology. That's just a layman's term for trying to make them do the opposite. Unfortunately, that backfires a lot of times. It's worked before. But I do know of one situation, or a couple of situations actually, with jumpers. One was on a bridge, and someone was trying to say, look, you're afraid of heights, get down from there. You don't want to do that. They jumped. Another one was someone threatening to jump from the second floor, and the person down below was saying, that's not going to kill you. You got to go to the 5th floor. Don't do that. Just, take it seriously. Don't make a joking matter out of it. But I had to throw that in there. Don't try to wrestle a weapon away from an actively suicidal person. A suicidal person can quickly become a homicidal person. Unless you have special training in how to neutralize a threat, to use a term that law enforcement uses, don't try to wrestle it away. That's what law enforcement's for. They have training in that. Let them do it. Also, it is no longer considered best practice to use a no suicide contract. Now, I know when I was in school, we were taught this. I don't know if you were taught to use
used them many times.
Many
in
times.
my career.
I've written many of them. But now that we've had a lot more time to look at the effectiveness of it, it is not effective. In fact, it could make us more liable if we use a no suicide contract. No suicide contracts were intended, they go back decades, and they were intended for use with hospitalized patients or those that are in a long-term therapeutic relationship with their therapist. And it was a no harm agreement or a no suicide contract, whatever you want to call it, but it was used to have that person actually commit to the therapist, I will not carry out a plan, I will not hurt myself without talking to you first. I will come to you first. We will have a discussion first. And somehow that morphed over the years into the person signs a statement that says, I will not kill myself. It goes in the chart and we wash our hands of it and we think, oh, I'm covered. I can't be sued now. Well, there's a lot of things wrong with that. First of all, oh, yes, you can be sued. Anybody can be sued for anything. But also, if it's the first or second, if you don't have a long-term relationship with this person, the only thing they hear is that you're afraid of litigation. You're more concerned about you being sued than you are about their mental health. So it really puts up a barrier there with your client or your patient. The other thing is, if you think about it, you're taking a person that you believe is in, especially if they're in a suicidal crisis, they are in the midst of a mental health crisis. You don't know whether or not they are competent to sign a contract. I would argue that they are not. And I think a decent attorney is going to argue that fact also. So you can actually make you and or your organization more liable if you use these. Another thing is, young people can't legally sign a contract. They can't get married, they can't buy a car, they can't be held to any kind of a contract. And so we certainly don't want to use that with them.
You know, I know my experience, it was really more, again, trying to protect the clinician and to give, you know, kind of open up a conversation. And like you said, it was put in a chart and kind of forgotten. And so it was real top heavy on what the client was supposed to do. And it really didn't have a whole lot, okay, what are we going to do from a clinician side? Right. And so, and that's really where the bulk of it needed to be was, okay, this is what we're going to do to help you. Mm-hmm. These are the resources we're going to provide. I need you to let me know when you're, so that we can kind of move into that piece of it. And it was really more, I think, trying to, okay, for the client to sign and so that they wouldn't do anything irrational. But usually when you're suicidal, you're not making rational decisions.
You're not rational, that's exactly right. And certainly, they couldn't be held to it. There's no penalty if they don't follow the contract. So a no suicide contract, that's no longer considered best practice at all. In fact, it's considered a poor practice. The better solution, rather than a no suicide contract, is to actually develop a safety plan. If that person is feeling suicidal, this is step 1, step 2, step 3. This is what the client will do. Also on that safety contract or safety plan is what will the clinician do? What is the nurse, the social worker, the case manager? What are they going to do? It's a plan that can easily be carried out, and it's a plan that both parties agree with. So you're left with the feeling of, okay, we're in this together. This person is going to help me if I'm suicidal, and here's what I'm going to do. I know how to stop or at least slow down those feelings, rather than just, no, I'm not going to do it. Here's my signature. That means nothing. Well, that did not work. There we go. So what happens if you do everything within your power, everything you know to do, and yet the person still commits suicide? After the suicide, just like with any other death, you celebrate the life that was lived. Unfortunately, for centuries, we treated suicide deaths very differently than we treated the deaths from natural causes or from an accident. And it was almost like we were punishing them and their family for eternity. That's not the thing to do. We know that now. But we treat that death, the manner of death and the moment of death should not negate the entire life that person lived. Celebrate the life. Enjoy the memories. Talk about the memories. Don't avoid the loved ones who were left behind. They need that support, and they need to cherish the memories of that loved one. You also need to forgive yourself and anyone else involved for not seeing the signs. Very often, the only way that we see the signs of suicide is through what's called a psychological autopsy. We already know the outcome. The outcome was suicide. So we start looking backwards to try to see, were there signs? Was there any point in time where this person's behavior might have indicated that they were suicidal? We know it's not going to help the person who has already completed the suicide, but it could help somebody else. It could be a situation where, we've seen this before. This is a warning sign. This is a red flag. But you cannot punish yourself. You cannot punish other people for what you didn't know. A lot of people kill themselves with absolutely no indication that they were going to do it. So don't try to punish anybody, or just forgive and move on. Many times the signs are unseen. These are some resources if you are interested in reviewing them. But also I want to leave that slide up right there, because that is the number that everyone needs to memorize, 273-TALK, 800-273-TALK. If there's, especially for veterans, option 1. You can go to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline.org and chat. But there's help out there. There's help available. Make sure that you utilize it. Is there any questions, or do you have anything to add to this?
Well, yeah, again, want to talk a little bit about the procedure. We have a policy here at Public Health, and hopefully most agencies have a policy related to individuals who are making threats of suicide. And so what are those procedures? And I just want to go over it real briefly. I want to point out to you that it's out on the document library. It's policy ID 2014-010. Again, we've had several calls in the last couple of months where health departments, county health departments were dealing with somebody who was making threats of suicide in the health department. And so the biggest thing is, and you've covered a lot of this, and I'm so thankful again for your coming to do this for us, but using those interview skills, try to make sure if somebody is suicidal, that you're catching what they're saying, and that they're making those comments, that you're spending a little more time to what are their plan, and are they suicidal like now, or is this something that they're just kind of thinking about, or the ideation? So,
and don't be afraid to ask the question. You've got to ask the question, even if that means you got to practice asking the question, because it's very hard to say, "Are you suicidal?" and you're looking at the person. But we've got to ask.
And a lot of folks say, well, I don't want to put that in their head. Maybe they weren't really thinking about it, and now I've said it, and so they think, well, I've given them the idea. And no,
Never.
The idea was probably already there the whole time. And so, number 2, reports. They have a plan, but they haven't acted. It tells you what to do there. It talks about if they have possessions of guns, pills, knives, all those things you've already talked about. The number 4 says, do not leave a suicidal client alone in the health department. And so that's very important. You know, you talked about on the phone, don't hang up with them. Well, in the health department, don't leave them alone either. And so if that means, hey, come with me to the front where I can, you know, I have some assistance and I can get some assistance, then do so. If you're able to, you know, if you're back in the clinic in a room alone. But if you're able to get somebody's attention so that you can continue to talk to them and continue to get information while they call help, call 911, then do so. You know, and if it's an immediate emergency, call 911. Call 911. Go ahead and get them somebody on the way so that you're not waiting or pursuing that later. Notify the employee's immediate supervisor, the clinic nursing supervisor, and then one of the supervisors listed is going to complete an ARIA. And so those of you in the health department are familiar with that. It talks about in the home setting and using those skills if you're talking on the phone. And so I mentioned that so that you can kind of review that information as well. And also know that this is there, you know, if you're going through this at the health department, it's real quick. I keep it, I downloaded it and keep it on my desktop so that I know where it is in case if I need it quickly and I can get to it quickly. Then, you know, the other piece of it is, you know, can we notify their families? Yes, you can notify their families. And this is an emergency situation. They need to be able to notify a family member. What if they come in and they're suicidal and they brought a child in with them? You know, what are we going to do there? So, you know, is there a family member that can come get this child? If not, can we get DHR or somebody else to help us with that child? And so, you know, it's never easy, and it always seems to be 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon. 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. But the seriousness of this situation, the seriousness of what's going on, and keeping calm, you know, keeping a calm, and I think that comes with knowing, you know, what to do or kind of what to expect. Every situation is going to be different.
Every call I've ever taken has always been different. There's never been 2 calls that were similar, and I've taken a lot of calls.
Right.
And I'll tell you, I've taken more calls in the past year than I have in several years combined previously. So I know that we're going to see an uptick once those numbers come out. And a lot of it has to do with COVID and being so trapped in our home and not being able to get out.
Well, you know, it is COVID, but you know, it's a lot of things, to be honest with you, Renee. We've had 7 or 8 major storms in the last year.
That's true.
That have caused all kind of destruction. We've also had social unrest, a change in leadership at the national level, a lot of anger that's been expressed online, on social media. And so, you know, we talked about that rage. You talked about that rage earlier, a lot of anger. And so a lot of different triggers out there. And COVID certainly played a huge piece of that. And so that's one reason we wanted to go ahead and have this discussion today, is to bring it to the forefront and get people talking about it, get people aware of the interventions that are out there. What can we do to help people, and to start talking about it, and to give those of you in the clinics or those that are going to start, that have started going back out into homes, you know, and
right.
We're now doing home visits again, and of course some of you have never stopped doing home
right.
visits, so we continue to do that. And what happens if you get into a home and you're the only person there with somebody who is suicidal? You know, what do you do, and what do you need to do? And so, or maybe you come into a situation where they've already harmed themselves, and so how do you react to that? And it was great that you covered some of that as well. So anyway, let me see if we've got any questions that have come in, and if not, we'll kind of start wrapping up.
But just remember that there is help out there, and I do continue to quote Phil Donahue, that it's a final solution to a temporary problem. So don't tell somebody, oh, that's not a solution. No, it is a solution, but it's the last one that they'll ever try. So let's try everything else first. So sometimes that can just buy you time to let those feelings pass.
Right. So I don't see any questions. I do want to go ahead and again mention the 988 number. I'm excited that there's
wonderful.
a lot of resources that are coming into this, and so the 1-800 number is there, and the 988 number is already active. As they transition, it goes to the 1-800-273-TALK number, and so.
So is the 988 number for Alabama, or is that
It's a
nationwide?
It's
a national number.
National
Good.
number, and right now it goes to that 1-800 number. So as the infrastructure is built and the resources are put into place, both at the state levels, that's what's going to happen over the next year, is the infrastructure being put in with each state. So excited about that.
That's
and again, and the veterans task force that's working with those here in Alabama is continuing as well. So excited about that information. With that said, we're going to go ahead and conclude our program today. I want to thank you again, Renee.
Thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate you being here. Please remember that you could refer back to our training and our resources anytime on demand. The information is there. And with that said, I hope you have a great day.